The 2018 Progress Seminar, brought to you by the Redwood City San Mateo County Chamber of Commerce. For over 48 years, the Progress Seminar has been bringing together local business, government, and community leaders to focus on the most important issues facing our communities. With over 350 attendees from San Mateo County and statewide, this multi-day seminar and networking extravaganza not only features multiple keynote speeches, but also several intimate breakout sessions, including San Mateo County Housing Revolution, Redefining Expectations, Future of Mobility, Looking Ahead in 2030, Innovation and Disruption, and its impact on workforce development, Transit, TDM, TNC, and Autonomous Future, driving a stake through the heart of your traffic jam. Psychology of Change. For more info on the 2018 Progress Seminar, or to see the footage from past Progress Seminars, go to pentv.tv/Progress Seminar.
So let me introduce our keynote speaker for the morning, Mr. Paul Saffo. His full biography is in your program, but I will give you some very brief highlights. Paul is a Silicon Valley-based forecaster with 3 decades experience helping corporate and governmental clients understand and respond to the dynamics of large-scale, long-term change. He teaches at Stanford, where he is a consulting associate professor in the School of Engineering and is chair of future studies at Singularity University. Paul is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a fellow of the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Sciences. Paul holds degrees from Harvard College, Cambridge University, and Stanford University, and I know that we are in for a treat as we look out on the horizon and try to address some of the challenges coming our way in San Mateo County. Mr. Paul Saffo.
Good. Thank you so much, Kevin. And let me just swap computers here as I'm setting up. I'm going to try something today a little different. So I teach at Stanford. And by the way, thank you all for your support of Stanford and all that's going on. The Redwood City campus is so great and just wonderful. I just wish I could find parking at Stanford. There was somebody, their daughter was recently admitted, and I said, well, congratulations, now comes the hard part. And they said, what do you mean? I said, the one thing harder than getting admitted to Stanford is finding a parking place. Can I get some help with the HDMI cable here? I don't want to just rip it out on you and mess things up. So as we're getting it adjusted here, what I'm going to do, I just finished the quarter at Stanford, and average class size at Stanford is sort of 15 to 20 people. And great, thank you. And I thought I'd try something with you all that I tried with about 17 students. Do something interactive. This group is not much bigger than the average class size at Stanford. So I'm going to introduce a concept that you can use as a tool to help frame strategic thinking. And it's called PACE layers. In a little bit of background here okay, make my system wake up here. We all know what S-curves are, the flat spot and then the upward tick. This is where your options are just wonderful and all that. A pattern, even in Silicon Valley, is things take a while before they take off. And then once they take off all at once. So we always forget there's that flat spot on the S-curve before things take off. And what I want to do with this model is explain to you the reason for that flat spot. The model's called PACE layers. My good friend Stuart Brand first developed it back in the 90s. I sit on the board of something called the Long Now Foundation. We're building a 300-foot tall, 10,000-year clock into a mountain as an antidote to short-term thinking. So we think a lot about civilizational responsibility. And if you think about all change that happens, whether at the most local of levels or at the national level or beyond, there's a stack of fast and slow processes that intersect to create change. The fastest part up there at the top is fashion. Fashion's the kind of thing that is squiggly and changey real fast. And way down at the bottom is nature, which happens in a very slow, stately manner. And in between, culture's a little faster than nature. Change is kind of gradual with culture. Faster than that would be governance, and then a little faster than governance is infrastructure, and then of course commerce is faster than infrastructure. And each one, has its own characteristics. You can sort of think of, infrastructure is sort of 50 to 100 years. It's the thing everybody needs and nobody wants to pay for. Government is kind of every, 100 to 200 years. In the United States, we have a revolution in this country about once every 100 years. We're a little overdue. That's not a wish, that's an observation as a forecaster. And then there, of course, is culture. So let me give you an example of how this plays together. And again, I'm going to take about 4 hours of class time and compress it into about 30 minutes here. But think about Neil Armstrong, July 20th, 1969, landed on the moon. And coincidentally, the first microprocessor, the 4004, was built in Silicon Valley right about the same time. Except it was not a coincidence. It was actually occurred because of the intersection of two very different forces that we had down at the intersection between culture and governance. We had the Cold War. Khrushchev, we will bury you, Borsky. But after 2 world wars, our global leaders had the good sense to say, maybe we shouldn't do a third this time. How about having a symbolic competition? Let's see who gets to the moon first. And so you have Kennedy announcing that we would put a human on the moon by 1969, and off we were going. And of course, Kennedy announces this to NASA, and he leaves the room, and the engineers look at each other and they say, that's computational unobtainium, because vacuum tubes don't work so well in rockets, they tend to break. And that created the pressure to accelerate the development of solid-state electronics. That NASA and the Air Force were absolutely desperate for solid-state electronics, and the result was the mother of all early adopters. So who here is in tech? John, raise your hand. So they will tell you an early adopter is someone who pays too much money for something that doesn't quite work. And that was your government. And they poured a whole lot of money into Silicon Valley, and that's part of the reason why Redwood City is getting high-rise downtown now. So off it went that conflict of governance and culture led to the ARPANET, up at infrastructure, led to the 4004, which is infrastructure and commerce, and you get the idea. We probably got the microprocessor a decade sooner than it would have arrived otherwise because of the funneling of all those vast sums into Silicon Valley so we could put Neil Armstrong on the moon. Now notice I've talked about the layers. Top is the fastest, the bottom is the slowest, and it gets faster as you rise. But an important lesson for me is it's the turbulence between the layers where the interesting things happen. Just as culture intersecting with governance led to the moonshot, and then infrastructure and commerce coming together to help create technology. Thanks to NASA, there's a really nice metaphor for this. This is Jupiter, that's the great red spot, and you see the mid-equatorial bands there. Now, and notice those little swirly lines, that each of those bands is an atmosphere moving at a different speed. As a professor in the engineering school, I'm required to show at least one equation in every talk. But I know you were out late last night, so I'm not going to do that. But I will tell you that the name for these, you can use these at really dull cocktail parties. That little swirly part there is called velocity shear. Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities. And just think about it. If two fluids move past each other, you probably saw this in boiling water, that right where the speed changes, you get those swirls. The great red spot is just a really big swirl that stayed there for a very long time. And this is the last technical term I'll use. As a former member of the Air Force Science Board, I can tell you those are called von Karman vortex streets. Von Karman was the first chief scientist of the Air Force. Basically what happens is if you have two spaces that compress something, you get these interesting little swirls at the bottom. Think about Silicon Valley. The big swirl, you know, the great red spot, well, today that'd be a Facebook. 30 years ago, that'd be Hewlett-Packard. That Silicon Valley is all about interesting turbulences. And the valley was created because of the turbulence between layers in this pace layer model. So normal order is the top moves quickly and the bottom moves slowly. The inverse order is what's really interesting, is when lower layers move faster than the upper layers, you get surprises. When culture moves faster than governance, that's called revolution. And when when infrastructure starts moving faster and you get the idea. So let me give you an example of what happens. Nature moves very slowly. So I live in Hillsborough, and being kind of a nerd, that I've actually measured the continental drift on my property. That a colleague used to run the Leica Geosystems dealer on the peninsula, and I can tell you down to the millimeter how fast I'm getting dragged to the northwest. But the San Andreas Fault doesn't always move so slowly. So we had the 1906 quake. The fault jumps 24 feet in a matter of seconds, and the impact is up at infrastructure with a little help from the US Army, because recall that General Funston wanted to save the city, and so he sent his troops out there and said, dynamite a fire break along Van Ness. And the dynamite merely threw the embers to the other side. So that's why we call it the San Francisco fire and earthquake. Anyway, so the 1906 quake had a big impact on infrastructure. But what I find is when something fast comes up from the bottom, change starts ping-ponging through these layers in all sorts of unpredictable ways. Turns out the 1906 quake led directly to the global panic of 1907. Now, since I don't think there was anyone in this room who was here then, here's how the story went. San Francisco, and there's the headline from the bulletin in early May, gold shipped to pay insurance losses. San Francisco had burned in the 1890s, and the city had learned its lesson, and they built what was then the best fire department on the planet, and cisterns and everything else. And the insurance companies noticed, and they said, well, this is great. This is a safe bet to insure. And the insurers were, as they say, way long in fire insurance in San Francisco. The quake hits, the place burns, and we were still on the gold standard, but the United States had no federal bank. Our de facto federal bank was the Bank of England, and all of a sudden the Bank of England was having to ship gold to California to pay for the casualty losses. And somebody says, well, wait a second, the gold only came from California to England a few decades ago, and they said, we're going to turn off the gold. It led to a liquidity crisis that triggered the global panic of 1907, which in turn led to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, because after the panic, everybody said, maybe the United States needs the equivalent of a central bank. So keep that in mind. Something happening very fast at a lower level, nature, led to big impacts in infrastructure, which affected commerce, which ping-ponged back down to governance. This is how change happens. And this is also, this model, I think, gives a common language. So who here is from government? Just raise your hands. And who here is from tech? Raise your hands. Education? Good. As I'll get into a little deeper, this gives us all a common language to talk about change, because each one of you is focused on a different layer, and you have your own vocabulary. And very oftentimes what I see is when we see conflict, and I spend some time in DC and I see this here, the conflict is often because we have a different language, that we have different assumptions about which pace layer is important. So this is the first step of the process. You have a handout at your table. And again, this process I'm going to kind of give you a taste of each step so you can complete it on your own later, is you look at the side with the diagram and just take a moment here, and we're going to do this in like 3 or 4 minutes, and ask yourself, which pace layer is your heart at? Which place do you normally gravitate to? If, I was talking to a colleague in the Earth Sciences department, they'd probably be down at nature and the like. And of course, if you're in government, that your instinct will be governance. But ask it a little more deeply and just say to yourself, which layer do I naturally gravitate to? And just mark it, because you're going to keep these. So take a second, do it. You're welcome to talk to each other around the table. And I don't have a countdown clock up here, but I'll count about 2 or 3 minutes. Feel free to talk to each other. Good, okay. So let me just interrupt here. So quick show of hands. Yeah. This is clearly, this is why I love to be a resident of San Mateo County. That, we are a county that just loves to hang out together. And as you all started talking, I thought I could have wandered out and come back in 45 minutes and give it a... So I would just love just a couple of shout outs. So did anybody not figure out which layer that they're in? That's what I guessed. Who picked a layer that is different than the layer you work in? Show of hands. Great, hold on here. Great, let me come over here. Yeah, no, this is, Catherine, so what layer is your layer?
I said commerce. I actually like change.
Commerce, and what's your day job in? Governance, okay, cool, take note.
Actually, my day job was in technology, so that does go together, but I'm also in government.
Good, okay, so this is perfect. Carol's day job was technology, now she's in governance, but wants to be in commerce. Who also finds their heart is in a different layer than they work in? And remember, I'm a professor, so if you don't raise your hand, I'll just call on someone randomly. How about over here? Somebody over here? Great, okay, Wayne. So which layer is the layer you identify with?
I identify with commerce, and I was in governance.
And you work in governance. Okay, well this is, I think what we're seeing is an example of what's known as entrepreneur's disease in Silicon Valley. A whole bunch of folks, let me switch back here. A whole bunch of folks are in governance, but they would like to have stock options. Good, so keep that in mind, that the layer that you identify with. Let me talk about the nature of the difference in layers. The first thing about each layer is each has their own language. And the deep assumptions about a frame of reference, and oftentimes the conflict we see in civics is because people are talking from different layers. If you talk to a geologist and ask them about time frame, they're going to think 10,000 years is a very short period. But if you talk to a fashion designer in New York, they think 6 months is a very long time. So the dynamics, fast layers versus slow layers. Fast layers learn. Slow layers remember. Fast layers propose. Slow layers dispose. Think about fashion. Who here is old enough to remember photo gray lenses and leisure suits? That was a proposal by fashion, and the slower later culture said, actually, that's a really bad idea. Some of us in this room are old enough to remember bad fashion from the past that is coming around, and I'm just hoping we'll skip the 1980s and polyester. Fast layers absorb shocks. Slow layers integrate shocks. Think about that earthquake example. The fast layer are the fire trucks that have to get to something within 5 minutes. They absorb the shocks. The slow layers are the planners, integrate the shocks, make subtle decisions. Our building codes are designed to save lives, not save buildings. Everybody knows that in this room, right? So you always want to build your home above the standards of the building code, unless you want to rebuild it. You know, we make very, very subtle distinctions at the level of integrating shocks. Fast layers tend to be discontinuous and swirly. Slower layers tend to be continuous and stately until things like earthquakes or revolutions. Fast layers innovate, short layers constrain. So, like I said, I'm going to take you through a whole exercise in under an hour here. I'm about to ask you to take on this task, is identify an overlooked challenge likely to affect San Mateo County. Don't start yet. I'll give you some context, and consider the source pace layers. So I don't want you to just pick a challenge. I want you to pick a challenge nobody else is thinking about, if you can. So keep this in mind. I've asked you to take on a ridiculously large task with absolutely no preparation in a ridiculously short period of time. Welcome to the consulting world. But let me give you an example, a little bit of context of how this often happens. Go back to the 1970s, and there was an issue identified, desertification in northern Africa. And they said, oh, this is a very serious problem. The Sahel is creating a problem. The Nuer and their cattle and the Tuareg and their sheep are going to have real troubles. And of course, they said, blame the herders. So everybody saw desertification. They said, of course, it's the fault of the locals, the Tuareg and the Nuer, because of course, you know, they're, quote, ignorant people. They've only lived there, you know, for several thousands of years and are carefully adapted to the environment, but, you know, certain biases said it's the fault of the people with their cattle. Of course, that was not the fault at all. The fault was of the folks who were making the wrong conclusion. It was climate. It was the first signature of climate change. And it was entirely due to precipitation levels. The locals actually were doing their best to adapt and were much more sophisticated than the outsiders. But you just cannot overcome the fact that when you have a drop in precipitation. So think about that overlooked fact that it was the first signature of climate change and everybody was blaming it on culture, not on climate. And it was even more inexcusable because we had the first indicators of that challenge way back with Fonta Arrhenius, who in the 1890s was the first one to do the calculation of the atmospheric effects of carbon dioxide. And there were other indicators. As a forecaster, I look a lot for indicators because they're advanced hints of what's coming if you pay attention to them. In 1972, the first article on the greenhouse effect appeared in Nature magazine, but they didn't connect it with what was happening in the Sahara. And then things started picking up speed. In 1977, we got the National Academies coming out with their report. You know, this is almost 75 years after Arrhenius. It's become apparent in recent years that the human capacity to perturb inadvertently the global environment has outstripped our ability to anticipate the nature of the change. You know, as John Jacob Astor was heard to remark while sitting in the bar of the SS Titanic, I know I asked for ice, but this is ridiculous. So we had that. The evidence is coming up, but what was interesting, and then it broke in 1975 in the New York Times, and they said, oh, ominous climate change. Read the details. Read that yellow highlighted part. It's an abrupt end to the present interglacial period of relative warmth that governed the planet's coming. In other words, everybody said, oh my gosh, climate change is coming, and we are all going to freeze. That was the initial reaction was, this is going to cause massive cooling. We're going to have glaciers coming down to Minnesota and beyond. But of course, what we saw is there was that little part at the bottom. Well, maybe it was the end of benign climate and big change. So all through the 70s, climate change was overlooked. It really didn't seep into our consciousness until the early 90s. So think about that. Is there something overlooked in San Mateo County? A couple of other instances of how this works. Impacts tend to sink downwards. Revolutions come upwards. But something that happens at the faster layer, if it sticks around long enough, it starts coming down. So think about DDT, which was a wonder chemical in 1948 up there at commerce and infrastructure. started sinking down into nature pretty fast. And then also beware, the longer I'm in this business, the less I am of a believer in dramatic fixes to problems. That dramatic fixes typically lead to unintended consequences. Let me introduce you to one of the most decorated chemists of the 20th century, Thomas Midgley. Won the Nichols Medal, the Longstreth Medal, the Perkins Medal, the Priestley Medal, which is sort of the Nobel for chemistry, and the Gibbs Award, and he was president of the American Chemical Society in 1944, a hero of the chemistry industry. What could possibly go wrong? Well, you know, oftentimes the worst things happen from people working with the best intentions. If you wanted to pick the people who did the most destruction in the 20th century, there's a long list of maniacs, but there's also another list of well-intentioned people. He had two fabulous inventions that utterly changed our lives. The first one is he invented ethyl gasoline in the 1920s, which was a wonder solution to stop knock in engines. But it had certain unintended consequences, like putting lead in the atmosphere. Well, and so that alone would have given him a place in American history. But he didn't stop there. He also invented Freon. Can you imagine? You know, and again, you know, history is full of this. He had the best of intentions. You know, it's almost Nobel Prize season again. And Alfred Nobel, of course, established the Nobel Prize because he invented dynamite. Alfred Nobel invented dynamite in the belief that it would make war too terrible to fight, and ended up getting very rich selling dynamite to both sides in the Crimean War. And then out of his regret, he said, okay, well, maybe I'll create a peace prize. Or as Einstein put it so nicely, if only I'd known, I would have become a watchmaker. And Silicon Valley has an angle in here. So who here has heard of the ozone hole? Basically everyone. Well, you know, Elon Musk, who just launched, it turns out their latest launch created a huge shockwave that blew a big ozone hole bigger than the size of California in the atmosphere. Now, that was only one rocket, so maybe it'll close and it won't be a big deal. But if we start having lots of rockets and going into space, we may get some surprises. So part of the lesson is that when layers collide, that's how surprises happen. Something comes down from the top, hits something slower, unintended consequences. And oftentimes it's been lurking in the past and we haven't noticed it. So now, what I'd like you to do is talk at your table. Again, we'll take about 5 minutes, and think about what are some overlooked challenges. And think of this as a limbering up exercise. I don't, you know, I'm sure someone's going to come up with a brilliant idea, but no pressure. You just have to come up with something that really matters to the county in the next, say, 20 years, and kind of identify the source pace layer where it's coming out of. And I'll give you, well, maybe 5 minutes. I'll do 4 minutes and then check it. Ready? Go. Okay, so believe it or not, it's been 5 minutes. Great. So you can all, well, let's come back as a group now. Okay, everybody, stop talking. I can already tell that I will bet that the Monterey PD gets called within the first 45 minutes of your party tonight. So, good. And again, I want to emphasize, I'm running this process quickly like this just to give you a taste of how it works. So think of this like one of those old-fashioned television cooking shows where they like assemble the materials, they stick it in the oven, and they pull it out as if it was 30 minutes later. Well, I'm doing everything except pulling out the finished product. I want to pick one table here. So, okay. Jim's really excited to talk, so I'm going to pick on this table. We'll come back to Jim. Georgia, could you talk about what you all picked?
Sure thing. So we picked mental health, an example of that being suicide in youth, and that's something we feel like is happening but is overlooked and not really talked about broadly. And we think originating pace layers would be fashion, commerce, and just generally the compression zone in Silicon Valley. And pace layer in which impacts are felt?
Don't.
Okay.
Don't say that part yet. Good. Okay. Should I call on this table, show hands? Or should I ignore them? Okay. Jim.
Thank you, Paul. We talked about the effect of technology on the brain function and social interaction. We're a little confused about which source it came from, but we talked about both culture and nature and everything in between.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Give me your card. So so who here knows Jim Hartnett? Yeah. Who here is not at all surprised that my instructions were to write on this side of the sheet and he wrote on this side? You know, it's a sign of true genius that if you're given a lined piece of paper to write on, rotate it 90 degrees and scribble across the line. So, well done, Jim. And no, I could read it. It's a very special thing. So is there some table that is just dying to report out? Good. That's not enough enthusiasm. We'll push on. But you get the idea. And what I want to do is, by the way, I want to give a shout out to AV. Anybody who's ever been on stage, this is AV's nightmare, is a presenter who's got a lav mic and a handheld mic and switches between two unpredictably, and they've done a really nice job. So, and again, I'm giving you a taste of this so you can take this back with you and use it as a tool in your work. So next task, and this will be the last task, is I want you thinking about the challenge you've identified. Think about which layer you would apply to the solution. And so I'm going to run you through a quick exercise and pick a problem that's in the news and ask you to just talk with me, not as your group, but solve this, the problem of suicide bombers. And ask yourself, okay, if I have this challenge, which layer would I address to solve the problem? And so just quick suggestions, show of hands, somebody who's got to tell me the layer and the step you'd take to solve the problem with suicide bombers. Okay, nobody shows their hands. I'm going to start calling on people, and you're looking awfully close. So, Giselle.
Giselle. Hi, thank you. So I would go deep. I would probably go to either culture or nature, depending on the source of why.
So what would you do at culture?
Address the underlying issue as to why somebody feels the need to strap a bomb to their chest and kill other people. I think you could solve it temporarily with technology, but a new way would be found until you get to the source.
Good. So attack it at culture, but I like this. You could solve it temporarily. That's the lead to something really interesting. I'm so tempted. If you were still Sheriff Horsley, I'd ask you, but, How about someone over here? Somebody else have a suggestion? Come on, Shirley. Okay. So, Michael?
Hey, Paul. So I guess I would say commerce, since if those guys have jobs, then they're not strapping bombs to their chest.
Good suggestion. How about one more suggestion somewhere? So, Gail, you're sitting here quietly. Do you have a suggestion? Okay. You're a guest. Okay. Anybody else? Oh. Way in the corner. Okay, good. Hold on. I'll get there eventually. Okay. So, here we go. Mila.
I would pick fashion because you can make a lot of experiments very quickly. And I heard that there are women...
Okay, wait, stop. So it's pronounced Mila? Mila. So Mila picked fashion. Fashion. I mean, this is a serious problem, right? Is anybody slightly offended at the idea that you would attack a serious problem with something so trivial as fashion? I mean, how could fashionistas ever possibly solve the problem. So who's kind of annoyed by that? Does anybody think that's kind of offensive to say fashion? Fashion? Fight suicide bombers with fashion? We have never met. This was not a setup. Basically the message could be, 20-something guys who can't seem to have a social life, and explain this like, really, if you're trying, Okay, so forgive me, I'm going to go into gender stereotype here. The men in the room all remember, some of you old enough to remember, when you were in high school, you thought the way to get a date was to get a muscle car, right? So Horsley, what was your muscle car? What'd you drive? You can plead the fifth, but a 1954. So, and we all thought this was great, and it didn't quite work, and it was only, 10 or 15 years later we discovered that it would have been much better for our social life if we'd driven a Volkswagen Bug and had a copy of Proust in our back pocket. So guys are a little dense. But fighting it with fashion, the message would be, it's like really uncool to blow yourself up in front of your girlfriends. Well, that's exactly what Bono said in congressional testimony. He said, send Chris Rock and Amy Schumer to fight the Islamic State. And that was in 2016. And a very dramatic example was Li Bingbing started the Say No to Ivory movement in China. And guess what just happened earlier this year? China has finally banned the sale of ivory. So fashion is a great way to solve this. And going back to the original comment over here, you want to attack at multiple layers. Fast layers are like fire trucks. They run to get things under control, and they buy time for the lower layers to put in the long-term fixes. And think about that as a framing for what we already do so well in the county, private-public partnerships, examples like Samtrans doing such a marvelous job, the planning in Redwood City dealing with the growth and the like, that it's a conversation. All change happens as a conversation between the layers. And the bottom line is this, that successful innovation occurs as a conversation across layers. This is why Silicon Valley exists. It was a very fruitful conversation that started between government and industry and paid attention to all the other things. So the question is, identify layers which might hold a solution to the challenge that you addressed. And I'll give you probably about 3 minutes to talk among, so pick one of the topics at your table and talk among each other, and I'll come back to you in a few moments. Okay, let's all come back together as a group. You've had lots of time to talk about this, and you're kind of getting the hang of this, so you should be able to do this in less than 5 minutes. So I'm coming back to this table. Okay, one conversation, everybody. So I'm going to come back to the table of fashionistas here, and ask them what their challenge was, and what's the solution layer. Gail? No. She's already talked. Gail, you're on the spot. Gina, sorry.
I really didn't have one. We were talking. No, the solution, I took it from a different level as to fashion. The same reason you don't report people jumping off the bridge is that it catches on. So with fashion, you just somehow take the glory out of it or make it so it's not something in different cultures that would be acceptable.
Good, thank you. Give her a hand. So they're sticking with fashion, and I want to try one more table. So let's see. Oh, I like this table a lot. And Davina, what was over here?
So our issue that we talked about was childcare and home care in the county. And we feel like that has more to do with commerce and less about governance. And the money as far as like the tech companies and the need for younger families and how to address them on the childcare basis.
So which layer would you attack? Where's the solution?
Commerce.
Okay, and specific suggestion?
We didn't get there yet.
Good. Well, that's a perfectly legitimate answer, and it's a good identification that, yeah, this housing crisis we have, that there's something that's got to be done at commerce. Okay, so. Is known as a short between the ears, that he couldn't save me because I'd turned the switch off on my mic. That's why he's a highly paid professional. So what I want to do is kind of summarize here and think about not just the difference between the layers. Oh, and by the way, there was a conversation I had while you all were talking. Treat these layers with disrespect. The important thing about this idea is there are things that move at different speeds. When you go back to your offices and you're talking to colleagues, create your own stack of fast and slow layers. This is not Holy Writ. For example, you'll notice that science and technology do not appear here explicitly. Stuart Brand and I are always talking about that. Should they be their own layers, or do they infuse in the layers in different ways? And the observation was made that, well, fashion really is part of culture. That's a really interesting idea. And to me, it's like, just keep thinking about it, come up with your own stack of ideas. The one other dimension is time frame. Short-term versus long-term is implicit in this. And short-term immediate fixes get lots of attention, but long-term slow change has power. You know, think about who here is a sailor? Show hands. So, there you are, you're out down in the Channel Islands, somewhere near Point Pedernales, and you're heading south, and San Miguel Island is directly off your bow. And a small course change, if you're up around Vandenberg, will get you around the island with no drama at all. However, if you don't get around to doing something, you're a couple of 100 yards offshore, you can make a dramatic, 90-degree starboard side or port side turn and get around the island, and everybody on the boat goes, wow, great job, you saved us. Of course, it's much more sensible to make the turn, that small turn miles and miles away from the island around it, but the drama gets people's attention. So it's a plea for thinking about, in this moment in our county and in the valley and perhaps in our country, where there's a sense for urgent, rapid change. The power of slow is very important. The power of doing things now that may not be noticed for 20 years. And I'll give you an example. This is Charles Keeling, Caltech professor. He's the person who is the father of what's known as the Keeling curve, measure of atmospheric carbon. By the way, I just downloaded yesterday the latest readings and weekly averages in carbon dioxide. And he started this way back in the 1950s in Big Sur, not too far from here. The first atmospheric carbon readings were made, and he went, wow, that's interesting. It varies during time of day, and it varies by season. And then he started keeping a long-term chart of atmospheric carbon and got funding in 1958 from the National Science Foundation. We all know International Geophysical Year was actually a cover for CIA spying of Russia. So it's proof, government money came in and had good benefit for science and the like. And then he noticed this change. Now think about, as difficult as the climate change debate is in this country, Americans have the infinite capacity to make everything political, how much harder it would be without Charles Keeling's chart, if we didn't have this continuous record. By the way, it's not perfectly continuous. Shutdowns of Congress are in fashion these days. We had one in 1964, and there's a missing dot on this chart. And Keeling worked in complete obscurity. His budget was very small until the 1970s. Remember when he said, maybe desertification is the first sign of climate change. This is a classic instance of what happened. After 20 years of completely ignoring Keeling, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, and National Atmospheric Administration saw what he was doing. He goes, well, what you're doing is very, very important. move over, we'll take charge of it because it's too important for an obscure scientist at Caltech. Has anybody ever had this in their experience? You've been working on something for a very long time, and somebody comes and says, let the He-Man do it. Luckily, they failed, and that's why we still have the Keeling curve continuing. And so my plea is that it's important, even in times where we are distracted by the short-term challenges, to keep in mind the long-term planning. And we have debates like this going on all over the state right now. The debate over high-speed rail is a debate over immediate versus long-term. A lot of people said, let's not use that money to build a high-speed train. Let's use the money to fix an immediate problem and the like. And I'll give you a little story about this. And then I will close with a forecast of something that's got me very, very worried that's in the news at the moment. It's a story about New College, Oxford. It's a story first told by the ecologist Gregory Bateson. And New College, Oxford, of course, is not new. It was founded in 1378. And I admit it does kind of pain me to tell this story as a Cambridge grad. But New College is an old college, and their favorite piece of architecture they're most proud of is their Great Hall. Picture of it here. And the Great Hall, just out of the picture in the ceiling, are these huge long beams, longer than these concrete beams in our ceiling here, but made out of oak. So you can imagine the size of the oak tree that you would need to create a beam like this. But just about 100 years ago, the Dons were at high table, and they noticed there was more than the usual amount of dust sifting down from the ceiling. And so they brought in a building inspector, what the English call a building surveyor, and he climbed up there and poked around and stuck his finger on the beam, and of course it went in, and he came back down and says, well, your beams have gone to beetles. Everybody knows oak goes to beetles, and they're dry rot, and those beams need to be replaced. And they looked up there and they thought, where in the world are we going to find trees that can give us beams like that? Because this was before the invention of Paralam, and we didn't have Home Depot yet. And so they're thrashing around in the way Dons will do. And eventually, word of the concern worked its way out to the head of the college lands, the college forester. Because every college at Oxford and Cambridge has their lands and the like. And so the college forester made his way to the master's office. He said, well, your trees are ready. And the master said, our trees? He said, yeah, 300 years ago, when they built the Great Hall, my predecessor several times removed talked to your predecessor several times removed, and they said, we know oaks always go to beetles, and they're going to need to replace those beams. So we planted a forest of oak trees. We planted a forest of oak trees. And I said, and each successive forester said to his successor, don't cut down those trees, they's needed for the Great Hall. And your oaks are ready. And I think the lesson we should all take from this is, of course, we're dealing with immediate problems, and I hope you can use pace layers for a way to think about the fast and slow elements that are contributing to our immediate challenges. But we all need to have an insurance policy for our county. Take some percentage of your time to plant acorns. To plant acorns that will grow into oak trees, the shade of which you will never sit under. But someday, your great-grandchildren and your great-great-grandchildren might thank you for doing so. I will pause there, and I will take a couple of questions, and then there's just one other thing I will mention that's really got me worried about the county. So thank you for listening to me. So any questions or comments? And I'll probably stay up here. If somebody could run a mic, maybe, that would be great. Or just raise your hand, and I'll repeat it for the group. No comments, no takers. So everybody wake up. No, that's okay. Well, tell you what, Carol, I think. No, I was going to take the mic after the other. Yeah, no, I know. I'm just saying, I don't think. No questions. Should I just close with one other observation, and then we'll move on? Good, okay. So, as a long-range forecaster, I spend a lot of time looking for indicators of things that make me nervous. And there's one that started making me nervous about 3 years ago. And the news day before yesterday had this item that, yes, Tim Draper, the clown prince of Silicon Valley. You know, let's face it, we've got some folks who got too rich too fast, who've decided to make it their hobby to make others miserable. And I wouldn't say anything about Vinod Khosla and what he's doing with Martin's Beach, of course. But so this proposal to split California up is extraordinarily dangerous in a very specific way. And there's a long and interesting history about California trying to divide itself. If I had more time, I could tell you some interesting stories. This initiative looks like it's going to get on the ballot. And it's not going to pass. And even if it passed, it would need congressional approval. And of course, Congress has demonstrated that they are incapable of approving anything. So it's not likely to happen, but it's going to get enough attention that it's going to stir up people in the state. Our most valuable resource is our social cohesion in the state. This is a deeply divisive issue. If you drive up to Shasta, I had to drive up to Oregon for the eclipse and coming back. You know, every time I go through there or up in the Sierra Mother Lode, you see more State of Jefferson flags. And there is a real issue here. And the way to fight this, in my opinion, is not to fight, I mean, of course, let's make sure that it doesn't win at the ballot. We learned from the Brexit. But there are all sorts of outsiders who are actively involved in this. The Russians are way into this. There are all sorts of troublemakers who would love nothing more than to see California get into a fight among themselves. And we need to focus on social cohesion. We need to focus on finding a way to have a conversation with the rest of the state about our interests that we have in common. And I've been spending some time thinking about that, and I'm sort of at this stage where I think we need to start something, but I thought, what is a way we can start it? And I think one suggestion I have, just really simple, you all know the Bear Flag Republican sticker? Folks who think California should be one place, why don't we put this on the back of our cars? You know, we win an argument by bringing people in, not by insulting people. But I think the stakes are extraordinarily high. I've had conversations with the folks, and a lot of people don't take this in Sacramento, are not taking this seriously yet, and they're missing the point. It's not whether these people will succeed, it's whether these people will be listened to. And if we don't listen to them, the results will be very bad. And I'll close with one story that I think exemplifies this. Who here knows the parable of the long spoons? Every culture has this story. In China, it's the parable of the long chopsticks. And as the story goes in one of its forms, there's a very pious man goes to heaven, and as he arrives at the gate, St. Peter says, well, you know, we're going to let you do, you know, it's probably a technology type, so we're going to let you do what we don't normally let people do. You can go down, check out hell, and check out heaven, and see what the difference is, and tell me what you think. So this very pious man goes to hell, and he arrives there, and it's very different than he expected. It's not, you know, Dante's eighth circle of hell with Satan frozen in ice, surrounded by fire and all the like. It's a beautiful, beautiful space, not unlike the hotel we're in, with a vast, wonderful banquet, wonderful music, and just everything you could possibly hope for. In other words, it looks like what everybody thinks heaven looks like, except that everybody is starving. Because the forks and the knives and the spoons are all 7 feet long. And when they pick up the spoon, they can't put the food to their mouth. And he thinks, my God, this is worse than any hell I could ever possibly imagine. To be so close to abundance and richness and to be suffering like this. So he skedaddles right out of there and he goes up to heaven. He thinks, man, I'm not going back to that place. And he arrives in heaven, it's exactly the same scene. The same banquet, the same space, the same celestial music, the same 7-foot-long utensils. Except in heaven, everybody is happy and well-fed. Because in heaven, they have learned to feed each other. And that's what we need to work on here in California, is we need to remind everyone that we need to learn to support and feed each other. And that's how, in my opinion, we end that. Thank you.
Paul, thank you so much. Another round, please.
For more info on the 2018 Progress Seminar, or to see the footage from past Progress Seminars, go to pentv.tv/Progress Seminar.